Thanks, Russell, and it's lovely to see everybody here. Isn't it nice to be back in person? We've missed this, haven't we? And it's great to be here. And thanks to the Royal Society of Edinburgh for co-hosting this event with us. So it's my pleasure to introduce the Lister Medal and SCI. The Lister Medal was first established in 1944. It was established in honour of Sir Joseph Lister, who I'm sure this audience will be very familiar with, a famous British surgeon and pioneer of research into inflammation. It was first awarded in 1944 to Sir Alexander Fleming, again I'm sure very familiar to this community, a Scottish physician who was accredited with discovering penicillin, very important for human health. The award is given for really leadership in the advancement of science and science in the medicinal field, where there's a distinct benefit to society. And that's what we're awarding it for today, which we'll come on to. It's been awarded 16 times in the 78 years it's been in place, with the last recipient actually awarded here in 2016, again in conjunction with the Royal Society of Edinburgh, to Dame Sally Davies, very well known for her work on antimicrobial resistance. So we're delighted to be here again today in 2022 to honour Sir Patrick Vallance for his work on COVID and the COVID vaccine. COVID-19 was discovered or identified in December 2019, as we all know, and by 2020, the Pfizer vaccine received emergency use authorization from the FDA in the States. That was an unprecedented trajectory of science out of the lab into industry for the benefit of society. And that early rollout and all of the creation and invention that went alongside that undoubtedly saved many lives. And it is for that that we are awarding today to Sir Patrick Vallance for his leadership and vision. Clearly there was a team, there's always a team when it comes to innovation and invention, but certainly in terms of leadership and vision and driving forward for the vaccine development. So we're delighted, Sir Patrick, to award the medal for you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here in Edinburgh, and everyone says that the end of November is the best time to visit Edinburgh. So that was a great timing, and it's a particular pleasure, of course, to deliver this lecture, especially given some of the enormously influential people who've been before me. I feel very honoured to be here. I feel honoured also because this is about the interface between medicine and chemistry, and frankly, that's what I've spent most of my life trying to work at in academia, in the private sector, in the pharmaceutical industry. And much to my surprise, it also became important when I was in government. And I want to spend a bit of time talking about government and science and how that links to industry and academia. And I'm going to bring it back to then the question of chemistry and medicine coming together. So let me start with a challenge which, I haven't got my slides up, so I don't know where my slides are. There we are. Let me start with a challenge. And the challenge is, think of any area of policy in government where science, engineering or technology doesn't play some role or have some input. I can't think of anyone, whether it's how we build our built environment, how we think about our food production, how we think about our transport, how we communicate with each other, how we think about getting our healthcare. Every policy area of government, there is some angle which science, engineering or technology can bring to that policy consideration. If you move from general policy to defence, security and resilience, it's very obvious that science has a big part to play. And I'm going to come back to resilience later. It's very obvious for defence. And if you look at the way this has been articulated by government, about 18 months ago, the integrated review was published. And the integrated review was called Global Britain in a Competitive Age. And it was an articulation that the government said of a comprehensive articulation of the UK's national security and international policy. And it had 4 main objectives. And objective number 1 was sustaining strategic advantage through science and technology. That is an extraordinary change. That would not have been objective number 1 a decade ago. So the notion that science and technology is fundamental to national security and clearly important for resilience is something that now is evident to this government, to all governments actually, and you look around the world and you can see that is a trend everywhere. You can see it from China to USA to Israel to Norway. You look at countries and they are putting that as a key area. So it's important for all policies, it's important for national defence, and it's important for the economy. If you think about the picture with any economy, you look at the fastest growing companies in the world, they are science and technology companies. If you think about countries that are good at science and technology, they grow faster than countries that aren't. And that's because not of just the discovery, but the application of that in terms of applying to the economy the ability to turn your ideas into companies, into wealth creation. And this graph at the bottom shows productivity against R&D spend as a percentage share of GDP between 2015 and 2019. And there's a positive correlation, i.e. the higher your R&D spend as a percentage of GDP, the greater the productivity in the country. You can see where the UK was at that time, according to ONS statistics, and we were around 1.7% of GDP. They've now revised that up to around 2.4 or so, which puts us closer on the red line, actually. So there is a relationship between the amount you spend on R&D and the productivity in a country. So when you look at those 3 things, all areas of policy, national defence, security and resilience, and economic growth, it's pretty clear that we as citizens should care very greatly about science and technology, and we should care about how government thinks about science and technology because it's fundamental to our society. So if that's true, and I believe it is true, then you'd hope that government's good at it. And that's what I want to just tackle. Is government good at it? And what needs to be done if it's not? So before I took up this job, I sought advice from many people, and one of the people that I spoke to was Gus O'Donnell, who was a previous cabinet secretary, so the previous head of the civil service. And he said to me, science was good in part in government, and it was good at certain times when it came to the fore, but it wasn't embedded in government, in his opinion. He said, unlike economics, where every department has economists and knows when to turn to them and knows what they can provide, many departments didn't know how to behave like that with science and didn't know how to bring science into the system. So he said, you should try and do the same for science and technology as has happened for economics. And he said it wasn't always like that with economics. There was a time when economists were seen as a very odd group in a department. Why were they here 50 or 60 years ago? What were they doing? What could they offer? They're now embedded. He said you should try and embed it as far as you can across the whole of government. And so when I came in, we undertook a review and asked the question, what is the capability in science across the whole of government? And that paper, that report was published in 2019, Realising Our Ambition Through Science. And we found that science budgets in departments had been disproportionately reduced. And in fact, in many departments, apart from a few where it had been explicitly protected, there had been quite a steep reduction in budgets. And in some departments, if you ask the question, what is the R&D spend as a percentage of total expenditure, it was a fraction of 1%, quite a small fraction in some cases. Now, if you were a company and you said, I spend a fraction of 1% on R&D, you've effectively said, I'm a low-growth commodity company, and I can't believe that's what departments think they are. So this is a disconnect between what we need and what we saw. We also found that departments didn't have a clear model of science leadership. Some did, some didn't. Some were very good, exactly as Gus O'Donnell had said, and that there were issues about access to resources, administration, governance, and also the public sector research laboratories, which are the things that are government run, which range from organisations that monitor things through to places that do research, like the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, the Met Office and others. The PSREs were not being deployed as effectively as they could be. Some were excellent and some were very good but undervalued, and we thought there was something to be done there. But the striking numbers, in a way, are on the right-hand side of the slide here. The fast stream is the process by which it's a graduate scheme for the civil service. Bright young things come in, do a rotation, come into the civil service, and they end up in senior positions. When we looked at the generalist fast stream, we found that roughly 10 or 11% of the generalist fast stream had a STEM degree. Now, I don't know what the right number is, but it's definitely not 10 or 11%. It's also not 90%. It's very important, of course, that their arts, humanities, and of course the social sciences are really important right the way across government. But 10% with a STEM degree seems really far too low. We also looked at the number on a specific science and engineering fast stream, and it was basically 24 out of 1,200. So we thought, okay, that's got to change because this is the future of the civil service. These are the permanent secretaries in 10, 20, 30 years' time. So if you get it wrong at the beginning, you're going to be stuck with this for a very long time. So that we thought was a problem, but actually things are getting better. So my summary of this report was exactly as Gus O'Donnell said, science was pretty good in some places, very good in some places, but it was a mixed bag and there were some clear structural things that needed to be sorted out. So where are we as of today? I've already said the report Realising Our Ambition Through Science, I think, is being implemented. The integrated review has had impact right the way across the world. People have looked at it and said, that looks like a very sensible thing to be doing. And yes, science and technology is very prominent. So this has gone up the agenda on national security and defence. And I'm really pleased to say that the fast stream, which had been suspended for a while, is now back in action. And the target is to have 50% STEM degree by 2024, which I have to say, that was my ambition at the beginning. I thought it was very brave of them to say they're going to do it from now to 2024. We're going to work very hard to make it happen. It is possible. It's something that should be done. And I think will make a big difference overall to the way the civil service works. And I'll come back to that because it's not that you need 50% of people in government doing science on a day-to-day basis. You need some people who do science. Some people are laboratory scientists. You need some people who are in an obvious policy area that is clearly scientific, like net zero. But you need a lot of other people who bring science, technology, and engineering thoughts, a process, and approach to all sorts of other policy areas. So that's critical. And the government reform agenda, which is about modernisation of the civil service, actually says we will champion innovation and harness science, engineering, and technology to improve policy and services. So I think things are in a much better position and are moving in the right direction. But government doesn't exist in isolation. And for a country, a nation, to be good at science and use it properly, you need, of course, other things to be true as well. And one of those is the foundational science base. Is that good? And here, I think we can be much more reassured that this is a long-standing success story for the UK. And there are many, many times in and around government where people say, and indeed in everyday life, where people say we're world-class at things, and you might scratch the surface and find that's not entirely true. This is one where we are still world-class. And we have 3 or 4 out of the top 10 ranked universities in the world. We have less than 1% of the population, but something like 3 or 4% of researchers, about 6.5% of the world's academic publications, much higher number of the most highly cited publications. And that, by any metric, is a very strong place to be. But of course, like everything else, it's not a God-given right to do that, and it can be fragile. So it must be looked after, because you can lose this quite easily. I'm very pleased that the science, the R&D budget has gone up, and that was reaffirmed in the recent fiscal statement. So given the current economic situation, it's actually rather reassuring that that has been protected. And it does tell us that there's an ambition to keep this very strong, but we need to look after it. And this is very important, we are an island, but science is not an island. Science has to be international. We have to be international about the way we think about this. So the science base, I think, is in a good shape. And it's interesting that there's a long history of wanting the science base to be good by government. And it goes back actually to Haldane in 1918. And he made a couple of really important observations. The first is, and this leads to the Haldane Principle, which is often talked about and often misquoted actually, but the first distinction he made, which was important, was between what he called specific and general research. And he said, departments need specific research for specific purposes. And that's something that legitimately government should define and make sure happens. But there's also general research, which is the stuff that increases knowledge and is curiosity driven, and it benefits us all in ways that you can't necessarily predict at the outset. And he said decisions about which research projects to fund, so particularly the general research projects, should be made through independent evaluation by experts based on the quality and likely impact of their research. And this remains important. In other words, this is not an area where government should be trying to say what research should be done. It has to be protected. That, of course, is the role of UKRI and the research councils. And we're very fortunate as well in this country to have a strong charitable sector, which also does some of this as well. This notion of foundational research being important, of course, was relevant when Lister was around, and I dug out one of his papers actually, which was entitled "On the Early Signs of Inflammation in the Foot of the Frog." Now, there's no way that the government's going to get involved in the foot of the frog experiment, but of course, Lister went on to make all sorts of incredibly important observations, which did become very, very practical around the control of infection. The latest kid on the block in terms of curiosity-driven research and how things progress through to use is Arya, which is the Advanced Research and Invention Agency. And the aim behind Arya is to provide a different form of funding. It's in its early days. It's got a chief executive and a chair now, and it hasn't yet come out and defined exactly what it's going to cover. And it's often sort of on shorthand, people have said, well, it's a high risk, high reward funding agency, like the models in the US of DARPA, Defense ARPA, IARPA, Energy ARPA, Health ARPA, and so on. But I think its features, which are important, are, first of all, its independent governance. It's very clearly set up to be independent in the way it's governed. It's set up to have operational flexibility and agility, so it can go into areas quickly and come out of areas quickly if needs be. It's set up to have a high tolerance of failure, which is important, because anyone in this audience who knows about innovation knows you don't start innovation expecting 10 out of 10 to succeed. And certainly the industry I came from, the pharmaceutical industry, you actually start expecting about 2% to succeed. So it has to be tolerant of failure, and it has to take a long-term view. So this is the latest kid on the block, and I think is an important part of the system. So if you put all this together, that we've got government which has an increasing interest in its own science capability and is going to want to build on that and has increased its own budgets for that, and we've got chief scientific advisors in every department pretty much, apart from about one or two, and it's looking like it's in a stronger position. We've got a good foundational science base, but one that we cannot take for granted and must keep looking after, and we've got an industrial base as well. So in the industrial base, we are, again, good at this in part. We've got a very strong big company sector in pharmaceuticals, in aerospace, in financial technology and other areas, and they're big, strong, stable companies. We've got lots and lots of startups, and this graph actually shows, on the left-hand side, shows a number of venture capital deals into deep tech companies, by which is really meant companies that focus on developing technology rather than just using it. And you can see it's baselined against 100 from 2015, but what you can see is the rate of growth of those in the US, the UK, and then the rest of Europe is broadly similar, actually. We're doing pretty well, and we've got lots of startup companies. But if you come to the right-hand side and you look, what's the average size of the deal? Well, the US is much, much higher than the UK or the rest of Europe. So we're good at startups, but there's still an undercapitalization problem. And we're roughly, although this graph shows a bit more than that, we're roughly on average about threefold lower than the US in terms of the funding there. But that's not really where the problem lies. We've got lots of good startups. We have a specific gap in the UK in scale up. How do you get those companies to grow into sustainable companies with proper funding? And there, if you do a like-for-like comparison, we're about tenfold less than the US. So we know that that's an area that has to be unlocked in order to really realize our full potential. Because otherwise what happens is we get startups, they get swallowed by big companies, they go abroad, they base themselves in the US or whatever it might be. In order to succeed here, we have to grow those companies into sustainable companies. That means unlocking patient capital to be able to do that and getting a different investment scene in the UK. So there's definitely stuff to be done here, but it's a pretty good position to be in if you look at where we are in terms of innovation coming from universities now. So you put those things together and you say, that's actually not a bad situation. We've got things we have to get right. There's quite a lot to be done, but we're building on very strong foundations. I want to now talk about the integration of those. How do they come together and actually work? And I want to give two examples of resilience. And the first is COVID. So in 2019, December 2019, it was clear that there was a very odd outbreak in China of a pneumonia-type illness. And on the 3rd of January, I called back to the team in Government Office for Science and said, I think we need to start activating the SAGE process, which is the Science Advice Group for Emergencies. And over the course of the next few months, the foundational science base in the UK was incredibly important. It was important in order to be able to get advice from people, ranging from social scientists, behavioral scientists, through to physical scientists who understood things like movement of particles across air. It was important because we needed modelers, and we had lots of modelers because the country has invested in that over a long time. Some of the infrastructure became crucial. The fact that genomic sequencing has been well funded and well supported in the UK for a long time meant that quite quickly we could activate, and it was brilliant of the people who did this, including Sharon Peacock pulling them together, to get COG UK together, a consortium of people who would sequence the virus. And for a long time, during 2020, 50% of all the viral genomes in the world were sequenced in the UK. And that was because we had an infrastructure. We needed scientists who understood virology, disease understanding, and we needed to do clinical trials. And here again, the fact that we did clinical trials, we had a clinical trials infrastructure, we had expertise, we knew how to run clinical trials, was crucial. And if you look across the world, there were thousands of clinical trials, most of which were underpowered and gave no answer. The thing that did happen in this country, great credit to the investigators who set this up, was setting up a study that was big enough and inclusive enough of patients to be able to get an answer. And that was the recovery study. And the recovery study got an answer on the first therapeutic that worked in COVID after about 130 days or so of being in this pandemic. That's pretty remarkable. It also, at its peak, was enrolling something like 12% of all patients in hospital with COVID. So that was a really well-designed, pragmatic, large-scale clinical study. Why was it possible? It was possible because of investment and infrastructure. And the final area I'd pull out there is, of course, the vaccine story. And the reason that we were able to get a vaccine started in this country with the one that then became the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine was because many groups had been funded to do vaccine research, and the Oxford group had been funded for a number of years to do it. So there were starting points which you could build on, a point that I will come back to. So the fundamental science base was important for being able to marshal some of those resources, but you needed companies. The vaccine would never have made it if it had stayed in academia. It had to have an industrial partner. Had we not had big companies in the UK, we would not have had a domestic partner. We would not have been able to get that vaccine through. So that ability to have an industrial partner come in and say, right, this needs to be scaled, it needs to be done at a certain quality, we need to be able to produce masses of this for across the world, I think was really important. And the fact that we could do that and actually get that done where the company agreed to do it at cost price was remarkable and hugely important right the way across the world. The same was true for therapeutics. We were able to do things beyond the initial discovery of dexamethasone because there was an expertise, there was a skilled workforce who understood drugs and development. There were clinicians who understood it, and therefore we were also able to do trials to undertake an exploration of new medicines and new mechanisms of action. Contrast that with what was a difficult time, which was moving from an early discovery of a test for COVID with PCR to being able to get rapid diagnostic tests. It took a long time to get reliable tests. There were lots of ones that were mooted earlier on that turned out not to be reliable. So to get to a reliable test actually took quite a long time, and we struggled more than, for example, a country like Germany, which has a big diagnostics industry. So the lack of a big diagnostics industry actually made that more difficult here. So that infrastructure of companies becomes an important resilience question. And then, of course, the third bit is the government bit. Well, we had Public Health England on the operational science, that's their role, to look after the science during a pandemic and the operational side. And their budget had obviously decreased over a previous 10 years. And I think that's an important thing, that one of the key things that comes out from pandemic preparedness is you've got to make sure those sorts of facilities are properly funded over normal times, so they're ready to go quickly during a pandemic. And we were lucky also to have organisations like the ONS, the Office for National Statistics. And one of the great examples was quite early on in the pandemic, when we knew we had to have a way of measuring the frequency, the prevalence and incidence of COVID in the community. We needed some community survey. And we noted this, I think, 2 or 3 times in SAGE. And then it became very obvious that this was not going to be possible within Public Health England because it was massively, massively overstretched with everything else it was trying to do. And Ian Diamond from ONS said, OK, we'll do it. And that turned out to be an incredibly important moment because that study became really a pivotal study, not just for the UK, giving weekly readouts of what was happening, but it was looked at right the way across Europe and the world because they didn't have similar studies. In fact, lots of my colleagues in other countries said, why can't we have one like this? To which my answer was, I don't know, why can't you have one like this? But we did have one like that. And that wasn't just because we had a government structure. It also relied, again, on industry. So quite soon after Ian said he would do it, he realised he needed lots of people who could go in people's houses and take samples. A few weeks before, somebody from a contract research organisation had said to me, we've got loads of people who do clinical trials who can't do them anymore because we've stopped all the clinical trials. They're just twiddling their thumbs. So I called him and said, would they like to go to people's houses and take samples? He said, yes, we can definitely do that. And after a few weeks, they managed to get that right. And that became an important support for what ONS were doing. And the other group I'd pull out here is the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority, the MHRA, which became the first agency to approve a vaccine in the world. And what's interesting about this is that I don't think before the vaccine, before the pandemic, anyone would have looked at the MHRA and said, it's one of the most go-ahead regulators in the world. Now, it was good. It's got very good people in it, but it wasn't how you would have characterised it. But the way they behaved within existing regulations during that was remarkable. And June Rain, the leader, sat down with companies right at the beginning and said, okay, what are you thinking of? How are you doing it? What do we need to do? How can we look at your work in progress and start making our assessment as it goes on, rather than wait till the end, till you deliver us a file? And that made a huge difference. And it's worth reflecting that when the approval was given, many countries looked and said, well, you've jumped the gun, you've done it too early. But in reality, they made exactly the same decision 4 or 5 months later on exactly the same data. So MHRA behaviour was crucial. And then the final bit, which I think illustrates where this integration between the bits became possible, was, of course, the Vaccines Task Force led by Kate Bingham, which brought together people from industry, academia and government to try and tackle this problem with a very clear objective: get vaccines for the population by the end of the year. And it was a very different way of working in government. It was a very different way of working, and one which I think could be applied to other areas as well. An integration of different expertise against a very clear, definable mission. And my final little anecdote actually on government science and unexpected things, and it didn't help during the pandemic, but it's sort of interesting now, was something I came across a few weeks ago. I was being shown around the Natural History Museum, and I met somebody there who was very interested in bats. And the collection of bats goes back quite a long way, before Joseph Lister's time even. And he'd been trying to see whether he could extract from these preserved samples of bats coronavirus RNA. And it turns out he can, remarkably, and he's teamed up with colleagues in other museums around the world to see whether they can then begin to track evolution of coronaviruses in bats. Now, who would have thought that? And who would have, when they started the bat collection, thought this is what that's going to be useful for? Nobody. So I think that shows just the general importance of keeping these things going. I'm going to take a little aside, then I'm going to come back to my second example. So COVID is my first, and I just want to take one aside to talk about this, which was in the middle of 2021, the G7 was held in the UK, and I was asked to lead a piece of work with Melinda Gates, trying to look at what the G7 could do to be better prepared for pandemics in the future. And we decided to focus on therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines. And we said, let's just take a scenario. Let's ask the question, what would have happened had, at the beginning of the pandemic, the sequence for the virus been available even earlier than it was? What would have happened if, instead of 138 days to make a therapeutic, you could do it in 100 of a new drug? What would have happened if, instead of it taking 286 days to get a reliable, approved diagnostic, you could do it in 100 days? And what would happen if you could have made the vaccine at scale in 100 days? That was the challenge that we threw out to various expert groups. And of course, all of that is predicated upon an effective surveillance system. And what would happen if you could also then distribute those things equitably across the world? That was the challenge we set the group. And they came back and said, yeah, we think this is possible. It's difficult, not just for coronavirus, but for other infectious pandemic threats as well. Now, clearly, it's not going to be possible for every single infection you could ever think of. But in principle, what are the things you could do to get yourself as ready as possible to be able to do that? And the report recommended a number of things, but its three basic tenets were that countries should invest in R&D to refill the arsenal and to create specific technologies. So messenger RNA vaccines changed our ability to make a vaccine quickly. What's the equivalent that you might look at for therapeutics? Could you make prototype drugs ready against the major pathogen classes, ready to be activated? What could you do in the diagnostic space to get yourself more able to be able to move quickly? The second basic overlying principle was make the exceptional routine. What did we mean by that? We meant Do the things you're going to need to do during a pandemic at normal times. Use diagnostics a lot in normal healthcare. Make sure you've got a clinical trials infrastructure, because actually it improves your healthcare all the time. It makes the health service better. But it's very helpful when you have a pandemic. Think about widespread vaccination programs across the world that would mean that people were using these things, and you had the need for manufacturing facilities in Africa and other places that would actually be used all the time. And the third was agree the rules of the road now. In other words, don't be scrabbling around when a pandemic hits trying to work out what the funding mechanism is to make sure that countries can get access to vaccines. Think about the rules now and implement the rules quickly. So that, I think, was an important number of recommendations from a very good group that came together to advise on that. And the real pressure, I think, now is to make sure this doesn't drop off the agenda. As many other things come and are important for governments to think about, this has to remain important. Let me move to my last example of resilience and the way that integration of the foundational science base, industry and government has to be important. And like the pandemic one, it is again exactly at that interface between medicine and chemistry. And this is climate. And this graph, which will be familiar to many of you, I'm sure, is particularly important for two reasons, and it comes from many groups around the world. And the two reasons are, one, it's such an elegant piece of science, and two, this was the graph that in 2019, when the then Prime Minister was given a climate briefing that we wanted to sort of talk to him about climate science. And I got 3 experts in, and we spent a couple of hours with him talking him through what was happening. This was the graph that he later said was his road to Damascus experience of he knew this was important and had to concentrate on it. And what it is carbon dioxide concentration taken from ice cores going back 800,000 years. So Antarctic ice cores, you go right down, you can get very old ice, and in the ice are trapped air bubbles, and you can then measure the carbon dioxide content. And it bobbles around, you know, for 800,000 years. Then we appear, then we have the Industrial Revolution, and it goes off the scale. And so it's very clear, this is clearly a chemical issue that needs to be dealt with, and it's very clear that this is going to have profound effects on human health, and therefore it is a medicine-chemistry interface that is going to be with us for some time. So what about if we do this sort of dissection of the foundational science base? The foundational science base was the thing that showed this was happening. It was the ability to pick this up and to explain it that was so crucially important. We need to continue to fund that basic science base, because not just for climate science and mitigation of the effects, but also for adaptation, because whatever we do, some of the climate change is baked into the system, and there will be things we need to adapt for, extreme weather events and other things. And we need to understand everything from how you think about the flow of water across surfaces through to what are the drivers of local changes, which may be very different in different places. So things like sub-kilometre scale forecasting, work on clouds, very poorly understood compared to other aspects of forecasting. We need to think about direct measurement of CO2 outputs. We need physics, chemistry. We absolutely need social science and behavioural science, because a lot of this is going to be about how society responds, and we need research that leads to potential new technologies. So the foundational science base remains crucially important, but companies do as well. And companies do because if you take the net zero target of 2050, the risk of 2050 is it sounds like quite a long way off. If you think about the scaling of the implementation challenge, and you take something like replacing all domestic heating, or making sure that our houses are properly insulated, or coming up with an alternative to cement and concrete, or making that carbon neutral, by 2050, you've got to start very soon. You haven't got more than 5 years or so to actually get this right and make some decisions about what you want to do, if you're going to scale those things sufficiently to be ubiquitous by 2050. So as you work back, it means that companies are going to be needed and are needed already, not to invent new technologies, but to make sure that the ones we can already see, feel and touch are beginning to be scaled in a way that we can implement. That's a big challenge. But it's a challenge actually that's rather worth going for, because it's going to be a multi-trillion-dollar economic benefit from it across the world. There's a big market there. And you can think about carbon capture, clean fuels, ability to actually measure direct output, storage of energy. All of these are going to be important areas that need industrial might as well as academic interest. And where does government fit into this? Well, government has to fund certain things. So big investment in nuclear fusion over a long time. I don't think fusion's going to come and save us from this, but fusion might save us for the next 50 years. And we have to keep looking at that. But fundamentally, what government needs to do around this area is a big systems engineering integration question. Somewhere at the heart of government needs to be a systems engineering approach working back from 2050. What are the things that must be done now? Which decisions need more R&D in order to be able to make a sensible decision? How wide do you want to keep your innovation portfolio at this stage? And when do you start narrowing down to things that you must make choices on? And how do you support the companies that are needed to do that? And those, I think, are the key aspects of any net zero plan. And I'm really pleased that people are getting down to now delivery plans, not just pledges and aspirations, but true delivery plans as to what needs to be done. And I've already mentioned it, but within all of this, behavioural science is going to be important, because we know that depending on what we all do, the size of the problem is either bigger or smaller. So there are choices that we're going to have to make, and we're going to need to understand what the implications of that are. So I've given you two examples where these three things need to be integrated, and where if we don't integrate them, we have a resilience issue. And if we do, we have not only better resilience, but we actually get economic growth. And that's why this interaction is so important. And so that means that this is a priority not just for a bit of government, but for all of government. It's a priority for the Department for Transport. It's a priority for the Department for Levelling Up Community and Housing because of the housing stock. It's a priority for DEFRA because of food supply and other things. So wherever you look, this is a priority. It's not just a science ministry. It's actually every department needs to do this. And that's why I was really pleased that we managed to set up the National Science and Technology Council as a cabinet subcommittee chaired by the Prime Minister. With a little interlude in the middle, we've now got another Prime Minister who's chairing this, which I think is important, because this ought to be an every government thing, not a this government thing. This ought to be a constant feature of how we think about this across policy and implementation. Let me end by making one other point, and that is about diversity. None of this is possible if you don't have the right skilled workforce. None of it's possible if we don't have people throughout their careers who understand how they can contribute to a knowledge-based economy. And all of that is dependent upon diversity in all its forms, because these are really, really difficult things. And if you're trying to tackle a difficult problem and you decide what you're going to take is a group that all look the same, all come from the same background, all have the same experiences, you're not going to tackle it. So that diversity is crucial. And the diversity is in all the usual forms, but also, and it's been alluded to already today by the president of this society, it's the disciplines that need to come together. And I've alluded to it in terms of saying government needs to have more scientists, technologists and engineers inside government. So it's diversity in all its guises. And it takes me back to Joseph Lister. And you may or may not know, but Joseph Lister was a Quaker. And he was not able to go to Oxford or Cambridge because you were not allowed to go to Oxford and Cambridge with that religious view at that time. But he was able to go to my old institution, the godless institution, UCL. And that was important because had that not existed, Joseph Lister would not have been able to go to university and do all the things he did do. So diversity is fundamentally important for all of this and underpins everything I've said today. And I hope that's given you some indication of how government, industry and academia might work together around the subject of science with a special focus on chemistry and medicine. Thank you very much.